The morning started like any other. Jack Whitmore poured himself a cup of coffee, stood at the front window of his house, and watched the sun come up over the roofline across the street, the light spilling slow and gold across the freshly cut grass. He had earned this quiet. 32 years in law enforcement had given him more mornings than he cared to count, where the sun rose while he was already in motion, already responding to something, already carrying the weight of other people's emergencies. This was different. This was his. He lifted the mug to his lips, took a long sip, and froze. 3 police cruisers were parked in his driveway. Standing beside them was Linda Mercer, president of the Silver Creek Ranch Homeowners Association, holding a thick manila folder against her chest and smiling the particular smile of someone who believes they have already won before the first word is spoken. She was pointing toward a narrow strip of land along the eastern edge of Jack's property, gesturing at it the way a person gestures at something they already consider theirs. 2 officers stood nearby, nodding slowly, their expressions the careful, neutral of people who had not yet decided how seriously to take any of this. A 3rd officer stood slightly apart, younger, watching the house itself rather than Linda. Linda kept talking. Her free hand moved in broad, sweeping arcs. Whatever she was telling them, she was telling it with tremendous confidence. Jack set his coffee mug down on the windowsill and watched for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He had spent 3 decades learning to read the architecture of a situation before walking into it. What he saw in his driveway was not a crisis. It was a performance. Linda Mercer had called the police to remove him from land she claimed belonged to the HOA, and she had done it on a Tuesday morning in October, when the neighborhood was just beginning to stir, when people would be leaving for work and school and errands, when there would be an audience. He understood the calculation. He had seen it before, many times, from people far more dangerous than Linda Mercer. He went to get his documents. He took his time doing it not from any deliberate strategy of delay, but because a man who has spent 3 decades responding to emergencies learns, eventually, the distinction between situations that require speed and situations that require care, and this was clearly the latter. He found the folder in the 2nd drawer of the filing cabinet in the study, exactly where he had put it, because he kept things where he put them. He straightened his shirt. He poured his coffee down the sink because it had gone cold, then decided not to pour another. He walked back to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the October morning. Jack Whitmore had moved to Silver Creek Ranch 14 months ago, following the kind of retirement that arrives not with a gold watch and a party, but with a quiet handshake, a framed commendation, and the sudden understanding that the building you have walked into every day for 3 decades will go on without you. He was 61 years old, in good health, and in possession of more accumulated knowledge about human behavior than he had any particular use for in civilian life. Or so he had thought. In the first weeks, before he understood that accumulated knowledge about human behavior is always useful, in any context, because human behavior does not change its fundamental nature just because the setting does. His wife, Evelyn, had found the property online during a Saturday afternoon of half-serious browsing, and she had called him over to the screen with the particular tone in her voice that meant she had already decided. The house was a single-story ranch style on the western edge of the Silver Creek development, with a broad front lawn, a covered porch along the back, and a narrow strip of grass and old oak trees running along the eastern boundary that gave the yard a kind of natural privacy screen without requiring any fence at all. They had driven out the following weekend. Evelyn had stood in the backyard for a long time without saying anything, which was how he knew. They moved in 6 weeks later. Jack planted a vegetable garden along the south-facing wall of the garage and spent the first month learning the rhythms of the neighborhood, which houses kept dogs, which kept early hours, which families had children who played in the street on weekend afternoons. Silver Creek Ranch was a well-maintained development, the kind of place where lawns were edged and driveways were sealed and holiday decorations went up at the appropriate time and came down again at the appropriate time. The HOA kept things orderly. Jack had no objection to that, in principle. He had spent most of his career in the service of orderly systems. He understood their value. He had also spent enough time around orderly systems to know what happened when the people running them confused maintaining order with accumulating power. Evelyn took to the neighborhood immediately. She started a walking route that took her past the community park every morning, and within 3 weeks she knew the names of every dog along the way and most of their owners. She signed up for the community garden committee and started organizing a holiday potluck that would eventually involve 17 families. Jack built a raised garden bed in the backyard and grew tomatoes that were, by any objective measure, excessive in their productivity. The strip of land along the eastern edge of the property, the one with the oak trees, Jack maintained it the same way he maintained everything else. Mowed it, kept it clean, trimmed the lower branches of the oaks when they drooped too far. It was his land. He had the deed to prove it. The thought that this would ever become a point of contention would have struck him, in those early months, as genuinely absurd. Linda Mercer won the HOA board presidency 11 months ago by a margin of 7 votes. The previous president, a retired architect named Gerald Oakes, had run the association with a light hand and a strong preference for consensus. Under Gerald's tenure, the HOA meeting minutes read mostly like reports from a pleasant and slightly boring committee: drainage maintenance, parking reminders, the occasional discussion of landscaping standards along the main entrance road. Linda had campaigned on a platform of stricter enforcement and higher standards, which many residents interpreted as meaning she would make sure their neighbors kept their lawns nicer. What it actually meant, as the neighborhood would discover, was something considerably more encompassing. Within 60 days of taking office, Linda had revised the Community Standards Manual from a 12-page document to a 47-page document. The new version contained regulations governing mailbox colors, the maximum allowable height of ornamental shrubs as measured from the base of the plant rather than from ground level, the acceptable lumen output of landscape lighting fixtures, the approved palette of exterior paint colors for shutters and front doors, the required gap between driveways and the edge of the property line as measured in inches, and a lengthy section on what the document called aesthetic continuity in decorative yard elements, which turned out to mean that certain garden gnomes were prohibited. Gerald Oakes got a formal fine notice for his wind chimes, which had hung from his front porch eave for 11 years, and which the new standards document classified under auditory nuisance potential in shared open spaces, a phrase that Gerald, who had spent 40 years designing buildings and understood the relationship between language and intent better than most, said was the most impressive piece of nothing dressed up as something he had ever read. He paid the fine. He kept the wind chimes. He received a second notice. He paid the second fine as well, and started keeping detailed records of every exchange, which would later prove extremely useful. The Pattersons on Birchwood Lane received a written warning because their azaleas had, in Linda's assessment, exceeded the permitted height by approximately 3 inches of measurement. Linda had made herself using a collapsible aluminum ruler she had apparently begun carrying during her neighborhood inspection walks, which she conducted on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with a clipboard and the kind of focused energy that some people direct toward large and important projects and others direct toward the measurement of azaleas. The Vasquez family on the corner got a notice about their mailbox, which was a shade of green that Linda had determined did not appear in the approved color list, a list that had not existed 4 months earlier and whose creation Linda had not put to a community vote because, as she explained at the subsequent board meeting when asked directly, the board had full authority to establish aesthetic standards without resident input under Section 7 of the association bylaws, a section that previous boards had interpreted as applying to common area landscaping contracts, and which Linda had apparently decided applied to everything. The compliance letters went out with a regularity that suggested either a well-organized system or a great deal of personal enthusiasm, and the residents of Silver Creek Ranch were beginning to understand that the distinction might not matter as much as the outcome. People started talking, in the careful way that neighbors talk when they are uncertain who is listening and what the social cost of a wrong word might be. The general consensus, arrived at through a series of driveway conversations and back fence exchanges over the course of several months, was that Linda Mercer was technically operating within the scope of her authority and that this was, somehow, making everything worse. There is a kind of power that is most destructive, not when it exceeds its limits, but when it inhabits them completely. When the rules become not an instrument of the community's shared interest, but a mechanism for demonstrating the authority of the person holding the rulebook. The residents of Silver Creek Ranch were learning, collectively and unhappily, what that kind of power felt like to live under. Jack received his first notice in the 7th month. It concerned his mailbox, which was a standard black metal post and box style that he had installed the previous spring. The notice informed him that black was not among the currently approved mailbox colors, which were listed as antique bronze, colonial cream, heritage gray, and slate blue. Jack read the notice twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went to look up the original HOA documents he had been provided at closing. The original standards document listed no mailbox color requirements. He filed the notice in a folder he had labeled, with a certain dry humor, HOA correspondence, and went back to his garden. 2 weeks later, he received a second notice, this one concerning the height of a boxwood hedge along his front walkway, which Linda had measured at 22 inches against a maximum permitted height of 18 inches. The boxwood was 30 years old and had been there when he bought the house. He trimmed 4 inches off the top and filed the second notice in the folder behind the first. The third notice arrived the following month and concerned the brightness of his driveway light, which a visiting HOA inspector had determined was producing lumen output in excess of the new standards. Jack replaced the bulb with a lower wattage version and said nothing. Evelyn watched him file the third notice and said, quietly, that Linda Mercer reminded her of a certain type of person who had discovered, late in life, that they enjoyed having power over others and was still in the process of figuring out how far that power extended. Jack agreed. They said nothing more about it. There was nothing more to say. What changed the situation, what transformed it from a nuisance into a genuine conflict, was a survey. Linda had commissioned a professional land survey of the Silver Creek Ranch common areas in the late summer, ostensibly to update the HOA's property records. The surveyor had covered the full perimeter of the development, and in doing so had produced a detailed map of every boundary line in the community. Linda had studied that map with evident enthusiasm, and somewhere in the process of studying it, she had developed a theory about the narrow strip of land along the eastern edge of Jack Whitmore's property, the strip with the oak trees, the strip that Jack mowed and maintained, and had been maintaining since the day he moved in. Linda's theory, as she would later present it at an HOA board meeting with the confidence of someone reading from a document rather than interpreting one, was that the strip of land was HOA common area and had been mistakenly included within the boundaries of Jack's lot on the deed. She had, she explained, identified a discrepancy between the survey map and the county parcel records that, in her reading, placed the eastern boundary of Jack's property approximately 12 feet to the west of where his deed described it to be. Jack Whitmore was not a lawyer. He was, however, a retired chief of police who had spent 3 decades dealing with disputes, documentation, investigations, and the specific human tendency to present a confident interpretation of ambiguous evidence as if it were established fact. He had seen it in interrogation rooms and courtrooms and deposition suites and community meetings and every other context in which people were required to make cases for things they believed or wanted or needed to be true. The presentation always had the same architecture: confidence at the front, specificity in the middle, and a careful avoidance of the questions that would expose the gaps. When Linda presented her theory at the board meeting, he had asked 3 questions. What was the source of the discrepancy? Had the county assessor's office been consulted? Had a title company reviewed the relevant documents? Linda had not answered any of these questions directly. She had, instead, repeated her interpretation of the survey map and invited the board to vote. The board, which at that point consisted of Linda and 4 members she had personally recruited in the previous year, voted 4-1 to designate the strip of land as HOA common area pending a formal resolution. Jack had cast the single dissenting vote, which as a homeowner rather than a board member he was not strictly entitled to do, but which Linda had permitted because it did not affect the outcome and because she apparently believed, in that moment, that permitting it was magnanimous. He had gone home that evening and pulled out every document related to the purchase of his property: the warranty deed, the title commitment, the title insurance policy, the settlement statement, the survey conducted at the time of purchase, the county assessor's property record, which he had pulled himself from the county's online portal. He had spread them out on the dining room table and gone through them one by one, and Evelyn had brought him a cup of tea at some point during this process and sat with him for a while without asking questions, which was one of the qualities he had valued most in her over the years, the ability to be present without requiring the situation to explain itself before it was ready to. Every document was consistent. The eastern boundary of his property was described in each one as running along the same line, 12 feet east of where Linda's new survey claimed it to be. The strip of land was his. It had been his when he bought the house. It had been correctly described in every official document in his possession. The survey that Linda had commissioned was a recent one, and a survey conducted correctly was a reliable instrument, but a survey was only as useful as its interpretation, and Jack had read enough boundary descriptions in his career. Property disputes had featured in more criminal matters than people generally supposed to understand, that what Linda's surveyor had identified was almost certainly a notation discrepancy in an older set of records that had already been resolved by the time the property was sold to him. He could not prove this sitting at his dining room table, but he was confident enough in the reading to know where to look next. He organized the documents into a folder, made 2 additional copies of each one, and sent a certified letter to the HOA board informing them that he did not recognize the validity of the vote and intended to continue maintaining the strip of land as his own. He also contacted the county recorder's office to request an official confirmation of his property boundaries. The confirmation arrived 12 days later. It agreed with his deed. He filed it behind the other documents. Linda sent him a formal written demand to vacate the strip of land within 30 days. Jack Whitmore had been served with more documents in his career than he could possibly count. Search warrants, court orders, subpoenas, formal complaints, administrative notices, union grievances, civil litigation filings. He had a practiced relationship with paperwork. He read Linda's demand letter carefully, noted that it cited the HOA board's internal vote as its legal basis, and referenced no statute, regulation, court order, or county record, and placed it in the folder with the others. He then went outside, walked to the strip of land, and spent 45 minutes trimming the lower branches of the oak trees. He had trimmed those branches every autumn since moving in. He trimmed them again. When he came back inside, Evelyn handed him a glass of water and asked if he was worried. He told her honestly that he was not, but Linda was escalating. Additional letters arrived over the following weeks, each one slightly more formal in its language, each one citing the board's authority in broader terms. A notice appeared on the community bulletin board, the physical one mounted outside the pool gate, informing residents that unauthorized use of HOA common areas was a violation subject to fines. Several neighbors asked Jack, carefully, what was happening. He explained the situation with the same calm he had used to explain difficult situations for most of his adult life. He showed them the documents. He answered their questions. He did not editorialize about Linda's motives or character, though he was aware that the documents themselves made a fairly clear statement about the quality of her legal reasoning. One neighbor, a retired school teacher named Patricia Holt, who lived 3 houses down, told him that she thought the whole thing was outrageous and that she had been drafting a letter to the board. He thanked her and said it wasn't necessary, but that he appreciated the sentiment. Then Linda announced, at a brief and poorly attended HOA board meeting in late September, that she would be taking steps to resolve the matter definitively. She did not specify what those steps would be. She said them in the particular tone of someone who has a plan and considers it decisive. Jack noted the announcement, said nothing, and drove home. He did not sleep particularly poorly that night, though Evelyn did. The morning the police cruisers arrived, Jack dressed himself in clean slacks and a button-down shirt, gathered his folder of documents, and walked out his front door at a pace that could not be described as hurrying. Linda was still talking to the officers when he crossed the porch and came down the front steps. The street had already begun to take notice. A woman from across the way had appeared on her driveway, pretending to check her mailbox. 2 men from the next block were standing on the sidewalk with the specific body language of people who had come for a reason but were trying to appear as if they had arrived by coincidence. One neighbor, Gerald Oakes, the former HOA president, who lived 4 houses north, had positioned himself in his front yard with what could only be described as an excellent view of the proceedings. Gerald was holding a cup of coffee. He had also brought a folding chair. The officers turned as Jack approached. Linda turned too, and her smile tightened very slightly at the corners, the way a smile tightens when the person wearing it realizes the situation may not be unfolding exactly as rehearsed. She had planned this carefully, the early morning timing, the multiple cruisers, the audience of a neighborhood just waking up, and she had planned it as a performance whose conclusion was already written. Jack coming down his own front steps with a folder under his arm and an expression of complete equanimity was not the opening scene she had scripted. The officer at the front, whose nameplate read S. Hayes, introduced himself and explained that they had received a complaint regarding a property boundary dispute and were there to assess the situation and ensure everything was handled lawfully. He was professional about it. Jack had trained officers to be professional about it, and he recognized the tone, the careful neutrality of someone who had not yet formed a view of the situation and was not going to form one until they had heard it fully. He confirmed his name and address and said he was happy to discuss the matter. Linda began speaking immediately, explaining that Mr. Whitmore had been repeatedly notified that the strip of land was HOA property and had repeatedly refused to comply with the board's directive, and that this constituted trespassing, and she needed the officers to remove him from the disputed area at once. Officer Hayes held up a hand and asked Linda, politely, to allow Mr. Whitmore to respond. Linda paused, visibly displeased, and then continued talking anyway, which required Hayes to ask her a second time. She stopped. Jack told Hayes, briefly and clearly, that the strip of land was within his property boundaries as described in his deed and confirmed by the county recorder's office. He said he had documentation for all of it and held up the folder. Hayes asked if he could see it. Jack handed it over. Hayes opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. This took several minutes, during which Linda attempted twice to redirect the conversation and was redirected back by Hayes each time, with an even-handedness that was starting to become its own form of commentary. The second officer, whose nameplate read M. Torres, had moved to stand beside Hayes and was also looking at the documents. The third officer had remained slightly apart from the group. He was a younger man, perhaps 30, with dark hair and the careful posture of someone who had recently completed an advanced training program. He had not said anything since Jack came outside. He was looking at Jack's face. The third officer's nameplate read D. Ruiz. Jack noticed the younger man looking at him but did not react. He waited. Hayes was asking Linda to provide her documentation. Linda opened her folder and produced the HOA board's resolution, the section of the new survey she believed supported her position, and a printed copy of the demand letter she had sent to Jack. Hayes examined each item. Ruiz still had not moved. He was still watching Jack. Then, quietly, he stepped forward and asked if he could see Jack's identification. Jack produced his driver's license. Ruiz looked at it. He looked at it for several seconds longer than was required to confirm the name and address. Then he looked up. There was a particular kind of recognition that Jack had seen many times over the course of his career, the moment when someone placed a face they knew in a context they hadn't expected it. The slight widening of the eyes, the brief recalibration. He saw it now in Daniel Ruiz's face, followed immediately by the careful, professional composure of someone who understood that the appropriate response to surprise was to take a breath and proceed correctly. Ruiz handed the license back to Jack. His expression was neutral. He stepped back. And then, after a moment that seemed to occupy more space than its actual duration would suggest, he spoke. "Chief Whitmore?" The words landed on the driveway the way certain words do, quietly, without drama, but with an effect that was immediately and obviously disproportionate to their volume. Linda's head turned sharply toward Ruiz. Hayes looked up from the documents. Torres straightened slightly. Gerald Oakes, from his folding chair 4 houses away, appeared to lean slightly forward. Daniel Ruiz had joined the city police department 9 years ago as a patrol officer assigned to the Eastern District. Jack Whitmore had been chief of police for 4 of those years before his retirement, and in that time Ruiz had crossed his path on several occasions that neither man had forgotten. The first was early in Ruiz's career, when a training exercise had gone sideways in a way that left the junior officers uncertain how to proceed, and Jack had stepped in not with reprimand but with a quiet 10-minute conversation that had clarified the situation and redirected everyone involved toward the correct outcome. He had not singled Ruiz out in that conversation, had addressed the group as a whole, but the substance of what he said had been exactly the thing Ruiz needed to hear at that point in his career, something about the difference between following procedure and understanding why the procedure existed, which were not always the same thing, and mattered most when they weren't. Ruiz had carried that distinction forward. It had shaped the way he wrote reports, the way he managed the specific tension between letter and intent that appeared in every complicated call he responded to. He had not thought about the moment itself for years, but he had been thinking in the mode it had taught him every day since. The second occasion was during a community mediation that Jack had personally overseen, in which Ruiz's careful and detailed report had proved decisive in resolving a complicated situation in a way that Jack had commended formally and specifically. He had not commended it in a general way, not good work this week delivered at roll call, but in the specific terms of what Ruiz had documented and why it mattered, which was a different kind of recognition entirely, the kind that told an officer their judgment had been not just noticed but understood. These were the kinds of exchanges that shaped a career, that a young officer carried forward as evidence of what good leadership looked like. Ruiz had carried them. He confirmed that now with the look on his face, when he said the name, not familiarity exactly, but something closer to respect that had been stored for a long time and was now being carefully retrieved. "Officer Ruiz," Jack said, and let the recognition stand between them at exactly the right weight, neither amplified into a reunion nor minimized into a coincidence. Linda's composure, which had been the kind of brittle certainty that holds together only as long as circumstances go as planned, began visibly to strain. "What is this?" she said. "Do you two know each other? Because if there's a conflict of interest here, I need it disclosed right now." Hayes turned to look at Linda with the expression of a man who was beginning to form certain opinions about her that he was, for the moment, declining to share. He returned his attention to the documents. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd ask you to let us continue reviewing the materials." He held up the county recorder's confirmation letter. "Mr. Whitmore, this is a formal confirmation from the county, dated within the past 30 days? Jack said it was. Hayes looked at it again. Torres had moved to look at the HOA survey section Linda had provided. After a moment, Torres said, quietly, that the survey excerpt Linda had brought didn't appear to include a boundary call reference, which was typically how you would establish a legal boundary line from a survey. Linda said that she had interpreted it differently. Torres did not respond to this. The crowd on the street had grown. Patricia Holt was there now, and the Vasquezes, and a young couple from the far end of the block, who had moved in only 2 months ago and appeared uncertain what exactly they were witnessing, but had decided it was worth watching. Gerald Oakes had not moved from his folding chair. Someone had brought him what appeared to be a second cup of coffee, though he was showing no signs of needing it to stay alert. Linda, recognizing that the situation was no longer unfolding on the trajectory she had planned, pivoted. She announced, loudly enough that everyone in the vicinity could hear, that she was formally lodging a complaint against Officer Ruiz for a conflict of interest due to his apparent prior relationship with the defendant. She used the word defendant, which Jack noted without comment, and that she expected the matter to be escalated to a superior officer immediately. Hayes told her he would note the concern. Ruiz said, with the kind of calm that is not indifference but its opposite, that he welcomed any review of his conduct, and that his role in the current situation was identical to that of any officer reviewing a civil matter. He had requested identification and examined it, which was standard procedure. He said this without affect, without defensiveness, and without looking away from Linda as he said it. Linda told him that his prior relationship with Mr. Whitmore created an appearance of impropriety. Ruiz said, gently, that having previously worked in the same department as a senior officer was not a relationship that created any conflict in a property boundary dispute. Then he stopped talking. Hayes made a note. Jack did not say anything during this exchange. He had found, over the course of his career, that there were situations in which the most powerful contribution a person could make was to remain completely still and let the other person speak. This was one of those situations. Linda was talking, and with each additional sentence, she was providing a progressively clearer account of the gap between her confidence and her actual legal standing. Hayes had gone back to the folder and was reviewing it item by item slowly. Torres was on the phone, very quietly, with someone Jack suspected was the county assessor's office or the records division. The folding chair contingent on the sidewalk was absolutely attentive. Linda made a demand that the situation be escalated to a captain. Hayes said he would make a call. He stepped away from the group. When he returned, he said that Captain Robert Sullivan was in the area and would come by to review the matter. Linda said, with evident satisfaction, that was what she had expected. Then she crossed her arms and looked at Jack with the expression of someone who is certain they have just made a decisive move. Captain Robert Sullivan arrived 12 minutes later in an unmarked car. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with the particular unhurried walk of someone who had been responding to other people's emergencies for a very long time and had long since stopped being surprised by the variety of forms those emergencies could take. He parked at the curb rather than in the driveway, which Jack noted as a small and accurate signal about how Sullivan understood his role in the situation he was there to assess, not to occupy. He listened to Hayes' summary briefing without interrupting, asking 2 clarifying questions at the end, both of them specific and both of them about the documentary record rather than the personalities involved. He took the documents Jack's full folder and examined them methodically, the way a person examines things when they intend to actually understand what they are looking at, rather than confirm a conclusion they have already reached. Sullivan's expression throughout was neutral. He was wearing reading glasses, which he had produced from his breast pocket, and he moved through the pages with the kind of focused attention that had nothing performative about it. He spent additional time on the county recorder's confirmation letter, reading it twice, then comparing it against the deed description. He looked at the HOA board's resolution and Linda's survey excerpt with the same care, though he spent less time on them. Then he looked at Jack. There was the recognition again, and this time Jack felt it land with a different weight, because Sullivan was not a young officer with the memory of a good mentor. Sullivan was a peer, a man who had worked in the same system at an adjacent level for an overlapping period of years. They had met on perhaps a dozen occasions. joint training exercises, a regional law enforcement conference, a multi-agency operation 6 years ago that Sullivan had coordinated and that had required a level of interagency coordination Jack had found genuinely impressive. They had not been close, but they had been, in the way that certain professionals in overlapping fields are known quantities to each other. Sullivan said Jack's name with the kind of flatness that contains no surprise, as if a man of Jack's record and character turning out to have his paperwork completely in order was not, in fact, surprising at all. He turned to Linda. What followed was not dramatic, in the way that certain people in the gathered crowd might have hoped it would be. Sullivan did not raise his voice. He did not engage in extended back and forth. He summarized the situation as he understood it from the documents, noted that the county recorder's confirmation was the relevant legal instrument for establishing property boundaries, and that it supported Jack's deed description, observed that the HOA board's internal vote was not a legal instrument capable of overriding a recorded deed or county confirmation, and stated that in his assessment there was no basis for any law enforcement action regarding the strip of land. He further stated that the complaint against Officer Ruiz, as described to him by Hayes in the briefing, did not constitute a conflict of interest under any applicable definition and was not sustained. He handed the folder back to Jack. He said something brief and unremarkable to Hayes and Torres. He looked at Linda one more time and told her, without any particular emphasis but with complete clarity, that if she had a genuine dispute about property boundaries, the appropriate venue was civil court, and that he would recommend she consult an attorney. Then he got back in his car. Linda stood in the driveway for a moment after Sullivan's car pulled away. The neighborhood was very quiet, not the quiet of people who had left, because no one had left. Gerald Oakes was still in his chair. The Vasquezes were still on the sidewalk. Patricia Holt was still there with her hands folded in front of her, and the young couple from the far end of the block had been joined by their neighbor. The quiet was the specific kind that falls when a performance is ended and everyone present is deciding what they think about it. Hayes and Torres were gathering their materials. Ruiz gave Jack a brief nod, the professional kind, the kind that carries meaning without requiring words, and walked back to his cruiser. Linda turned and walked to her car without speaking to anyone. She did not look at Jack. She did not look at the crowd. She walked straight to her car with the rigid posture of someone who has not yet decided whether they are angry or humiliated and is trying to project neither while managing both. The three cruisers pulled out of the driveway and the street went slowly back to its ordinary sounds. Jack stood in the driveway for a moment with his folder under his arm. Gerald Oakes raised his coffee cup from his folding chair 4 houses away in a gesture that was unmistakably a toast. Jack acknowledged it with a slight tilt of his head and went inside. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She had watched most of it through the back window, which didn't actually face the front of the house, which meant she had watched it by opening the front door and standing in the hallway for most of the previous 45 minutes. She did not pretend otherwise. She looked at him with the expression that had served as his most reliable barometer for 33 years, the one that asked, without needing to be stated, how it had actually gone, beneath whatever surface the situation had presented. He told her the full truth of it. The documents, Sullivan's assessment, the dispersal of the cruisers, Linda walking to her car. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's still our house?" Jack said, "It was always our house." She nodded once and went back to what she had been doing. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood processed what it had witnessed in the way neighborhoods process things incrementally, conversationally, and with an accumulating consensus that gradually solidified into a shared understanding. Patricia Holt wrote the letter she had mentioned to Jack earlier and sent copies to each member of the HOA board, a 4-page document that was careful, specific, and thoroughly sourced from the revised Community Standards Manual, the HOA bylaws, and the state statutes governing homeowners associations, several of which Patricia had discovered with the kind of focused research energy that retired school teachers are capable of deploying when sufficiently motivated. Linda had interpreted in ways that an actual reading of the statutes would not support. The letter was respectful in tone. It was not gentle in substance. Patricia sent Jack a copy as a courtesy, and he read it at the kitchen table and told Evelyn it was one of the better constructed documents he had seen in some time, which Evelyn said did not surprise her in the least, because Patricia Holt had clearly been paying attention for months and had been waiting for the right moment to say so. The Vasquezes, who had been quietly furious about the mailbox notice for months, dug up the original community standards document from their closing materials and shared it with 4 other families who had also received notices. Gerald Oakes called a meeting, not an HOA meeting, just a gathering at his house on a Saturday afternoon where 11 residents compared notes on the sequence of events since Linda had taken office, and the comparison was illuminating in ways that gave several of them the sustained energy required to formalize a petition. The petition called for a special election to recall the board president. It required signatures from 30% of homeowners to trigger a formal vote under the HOA bylaws. It reached 46% within 9 days, which was a number that surprised almost no one who had been paying attention to the neighborhood's mood over the previous several months, but which appeared to surprise Linda considerably. She sent a letter to all signatories noting that the petition process was subject to certain procedural requirements and that she was confident the board would be vindicated upon proper review. The letter had approximately the effect of rain on a river. 2 weeks after the morning with the cruisers, the HOA board held an emergency session. 3 of the 4 board members Linda had recruited had, in the preceding days, independently reached the conclusion that the property dispute had been mishandled and that continuing to press it would expose the association to liability. They voted to formally rescind the designation of the strip of land as HOA common area. They also voted, in a separate motion, to commission an independent legal review of all enforcement actions taken in the previous 11 months. Linda cast the single dissenting vote on both motions. The vote to commission the independent review passed 3-1. Jack received written notification of both votes 2 days later. He filed them in the folder, which was getting full. Linda did not resign immediately. She lasted another 6 weeks before the recall vote, which she lost by a margin that was not close. Gerald Oakes agreed to serve as interim president while the community organized a proper election. His first act was to repeal the revised 47-page community standards document and restore the original 12-page version with an added provision that future amendments would require a supermajority vote and a 60-day public comment period. The Community Garden Committee, which Evelyn had been involved with since shortly after they moved in, voted her onto the planning subcommittee the following month. Jack continued to maintain the strip of land along the eastern boundary of his property. He mowed it when he mowed the rest of the lawn. He trimmed the lower branches of the oaks each autumn. He added a small stone border along one edge, low and clean, the kind of detail that announces quiet permanence without requiring anyone to say anything about it. The strip was still there. It had always been there. The deed described it. The county confirmed it. The survey at purchase had mapped it. Every piece of paper Jack Whitmore had kept, in the careful habit of a man who had spent a career understanding that what is documented survives, and what is merely asserted does not. Every one of those papers told the same story, and the story was straightforward. This was his land. There are people who assume that authority is a quality of volume, that the person who speaks most loudly, most often, most confidently, must be the one who is right. Jack Whitmore had never believed this. He had watched too many loud and confident people be completely wrong, and he had watched too many quiet and careful people turn out to be precisely correct, and in 32 years the ratio had not changed enough to update his prior. The strip of land had never been in dispute, not legally, not in any document that carried actual weight. What had been in dispute was something else, the assumption, on Linda's part, that her position gave her the right to define reality for the people around her, and that the gap between her definition and the actual facts could be bridged by sufficient pressure, sufficient officiousness, sufficient repetition. That assumption had failed, the way such assumptions tend to fail, not in a sudden dramatic collapse, but in a slow and public erosion, one document at a time, one witness at a time, until the gap between the claim and the reality was too wide for anyone watching to miss. He had spent his career watching this pattern play out in contexts considerably more serious than a property line dispute. People who mistook the temporary possession of institutional authority for something more permanent and more fundamental, who began to believe that the authority was theirs rather than the institution's, and who then made decisions on that basis. It was a predictable failure mode. It was predictable because the mistake was always the same one, the belief that holding the rulebook meant you made the rules rather than simply that you were responsible for applying them correctly until you weren't. Linda Mercer had held the HOA rulebook for less than a year. She had revised it extensively and enforced it aggressively, and in the process had managed to alienate a majority of the community she was theoretically serving. This was a significant achievement in its own way, though not the kind one typically sought. The recall vote result had not been close. Gerald Oakes stopped by one afternoon in late November, folding chair conspicuously absent this time, with a bottle of a reasonably good red wine and an expression that was mostly amusement and a little bit of vindication. They sat on the back porch while the sun went down, and Gerald talked about the community meeting and the petition and the process of rebuilding a functioning board, and Jack listened and contributed where he had something worth contributing, which was occasionally and specifically. At one point, Gerald said that the whole situation had reminded him that good institutions require good people, not just good rules, and that the rules alone would never be enough without the people who understood what the rules were actually for. Jack agreed. He thought, but did not say, that this was true of law enforcement as well, which was perhaps why it had taken him 32 years to feel completely ready to leave it. The work had not been about the rules. It had been about what the rules were trying to protect, the specific human arrangements that made it possible for people to live alongside each other with some reasonable expectation of fairness and safety. When the rules served those arrangements, the rules were worth enforcing. When they didn't, the question became more complicated and required judgment rather than procedure. He had tried to operate on that principle for 3 decades. He had not always succeeded, but he had always tried. Evelyn brought them each a second glass without being asked. Jack picked up his glass and looked out at the yard, the oak trees along the eastern edge standing quiet in the evening light, their lower branches clean, and even where he had trimmed them, a small stone border he had set along one side catching the last of the sun. The land was exactly as it had been every evening before that Tuesday, in October, and would be every evening that followed. It held the quality that certain things hold when they have been argued about and survived the argument, not triumphant, not defiant, just present, entirely and simply there. He had not moved it, he had not defended it theatrically, he had maintained it, documented it, and waited for the documents to speak, which they had done as soon as someone with the authority to hear them properly had taken the time to read them carefully. That was all it had required. Linda Mercer had called the police to take it from him. The police had looked at the documents, the same way he had looked at the documents, and arrived at the same conclusion he had arrived at. And the neighborhood, the whole long stretch of Silver Creek Ranch, with its sealed driveways and its edged lawns, and its one retired schoolteacher who kept drafting letters, and its one former HOA president who kept a folding chair within easy reach of any situation worth watching, the neighborhood had witnessed it all and would go on knowing what it had witnessed, for as long as the stories that neighborhoods tell about themselves tend to last, which, in Jack's experience, was quite a long time. He set his glass down and said nothing. The strip of land was there, in the evening, exactly where it had always been, entirely his. That was, as it had always been, enough.